Welcome to the Steadyhand Cafe, where we dive into topics that you've told us are on your mind. They may be directly related to investing or perhaps more general finance in nature. Well, today we're digging a little deeper into estate planning with two subject matter experts, Julia Chung, co-founder of Spring Plans, and Lucy Main, co-chair of Wills, Trusts, and Estate Planning at Weir Folds. Welcome back, Julia and Lucy. As you know, you are back by popular demand because our full 1-hour session on estate planning a few months ago proved enormously popular with viewers, and everyone simply wanted more. Now, in this part one of a 3-part follow-up series, we're going to overview a really meaty and broad-based topic. That is how best to plan for passing on wealth to the next generation. We're going to dive into the key considerations from both Julia and Lucy's perspectives and their practice areas. And so, Julia, why don't you kick things off, and then we'll hear shortly from Lucy.
Well, thank you, David. There's a couple of key steps that I think we need to take before looking at the logistics of any transaction. So first, what can you actually afford to give and when? You need to understand your own current financial situation, really dig into what your plans are for the rest of your life, and determine what resources you'll need to not only when things go exactly as planned, but also when things go sideways. One of the most uncomfortable things about financial and estate planning is the ambiguity. We don't know what's going to happen next. We never have, we never will. All we can do is take the information we have right now and make some educated guesses. With those kinds of processes in place, and this takes a lot of time to really sort out, what's going on with my finances? What do I need? What kind of safety valves do I have in place if and when things go terribly wrong? When we've got that really set up, then we have a good sense of what we might have available to give and whether that giving can or could happen either during your lifetime or after it. So that's what was the first step. Where am I right now? And then the second step is, what does that next generation actually need or want? As parents and grandparents, we often feel like we have a really good idea of this, and we are often very wrong. Family conversations about money are just so important, and they're so uncomfortable. And the truth is that in family conversations about anything, we're always working with a set of assumptions based on our years of being in relationships with our family members. Those assumptions include feeling like we know what's important to them, we know what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and what they want for the future. We assume that if we set up these transactions around transitioning wealth, that our family members will completely understand what our intentions and meanings are when it happens. These assumptions are often what can cause entire families to break down. You hear about estate litigation, and we often think that what's behind it is greed. It's really not. Most of the time it's about love, it's about misunderstandings, it's about old wounds that never healed and were reopened and refreshed by a process that was just never discussed. We can avoid that by working with professionals in family facilitation to help develop the conversations we need to get to that place where your entire family is working with the same set of assumptions and moving towards the same goal. Then we can talk about how we do it. The right way is always going to be really unique to each family.
So job number one in estate planning is to remember your own needs going forward and to prioritize those first and foremost, because as they say, things happen. And then secondly, it sounds like active communication with all of the constituents that are in your estate plans is an important part of diffusing any potential concerns or challenges or potentially even litigation. Well, on that matter, litigation, I don't know, Lucy, where you're going to go, but what are you thinking about from your practice?
We're trying to avoid litigation in my practice. So I work on the estate planning side. So the drafting of the wills, the powers of attorney, the trust, and then the administration, avoiding as much as possible litigation. But I think the introductory comments are spot on. As sort of a broad brush, like how to approach estate planning. And so going back to the initial question, how best to transfer wealth or how we can transfer wealth to the next generation, taking from those broad strokes is having the proper planning in place. And we need those broad strokes and the topics that you talked about to be dealt with in order to do that proper planning. So actually having a will in place, which may include trusts as well, inside or outside the will, and updating those documents. So Not uncommon for someone to have wills done and 20, 30 years go by, the children are now older, and that's sort of the time to think about updating the will. But there can be many other times that you should be thinking of updating the will, or the plan itself, I should say. So major change of assets, change in family situation, relocation of people, marriages, marriage breakdowns. Those are kind of the key times to at least touch the estate plan, whether or not you actually have to update it. And then the other thing I sort of think about when people come to me and say, like, I want to pass on as much as possible to my family, inevitably it's a discussion about tax. So, and I think of it in 3 buckets. Probate fees. So for some of you, depending on which province you are domiciled in, will be very meaningful. And for others, it's a non-issue. So Nova Scotia, Ontario, BC are big probate fee jurisdictions. Many of the other provinces either don't have probate or it's a much lower percentage or a flat fee. But for those of us in high probate jurisdictions, there are ways to reduce and even avoid probate tax so that we can pass on more to the next generation. Then there's income tax that affects all of us across Canada. And we don't have a death tax in Canada, but we do have tax on death that we might not everyone realizes. We just don't call it death tax. And there are ways to defer that and sometimes to minimize it as well. And then for, at least for us in Southern Ontario, but kind of probably across the country, US issues come up. And the US does have a death tax, state tax. And if there's some connection, US situs assets, beneficiaries in the US, US citizenship, or US personhood, like you're a US person, we have to consider that because those are the tax leakages out of an estate. And then the final way that most people, I think, or final in terms of my list, but I'm sure there's an endless list, to pass on wealth is family law. Very common for people, and this kind of goes back to your comment about assumptions, but very common for people to want to keep the money in their family for as long as possible. Might not be too keen on the idea of their child's spouse inheriting anything or controlling anything. And so that is governed by the provinces. So there will be distinctions amongst the different provinces. But there are ways within the estate plan to protect assets in a family.
Well, we're going to go into probate in a lot more detail in a separate video. And to your point, I mean, we're just tapping into the absolute surface level of these things. But in order to give people a little bit of motivation to actually take this issue of planning for their estate seriously, in the last session, we talked about the statistics of Canadians who have and don't have a will. And it's still mind-blowing how many people don't have a will, even people of sort of mid-age. Can you just remind everybody what does happen if you die without a will?
Sure, yeah. And I should say, or die, so there's a distinction between die without a will and die with a old, outdated will. Sure. Just because many years have passed, I have many clients that come to me and say, oh, just ignore my old will. I'm like, we can pretend to ignore it, but until you sign a new one, that is the will, whether you can find it or not, and whether it's really outdated. So in terms of not having a will, that is governed by the provinces. Succession law is provincial. So the legislation will decide who gets what. In Ontario, for example, married spouses are treated differently than common law. So a married spouse is automatically entitled to something, not necessarily everything. If there are children, the spouse does not get everything. Common law, you can be common law for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. You do not have the same rights in Ontario as someone married for 3 years or 3 months. It's different. So if you're in a common law relationship, certainly in Ontario, and I believe in many other provinces, that's quite relevant. And then it would go, some might go to children. If there are no children, no spouse, parents, siblings, you don't get to control it is the key thing. Right. The other thing is you don't get to control when they receive it. So if some people think, oh, I don't mind if it just goes to the children, but if they're minors, meaning at least in Ontario under age 18, they would receive it all at 18, which for most 18-year-olds, that could be too much money in most instances. Yeah. And otherwise, if they need access to it before they're 18, it's a process. The court holds the accountant for the province holds the funds. If they need money, there's a process to apply for it. So it isn't, it's not something that should be thought of in a flippant way or not really considered.
Yeah.
And it's always more expensive to die without a will.
Right.
And like whether you have millions of dollars or a lot less than that, it's a much more protracted process. And I'm sure all provinces, certainly in Ontario, and we have to get bonds posted, and it's always more expensive and more complicated. So even just having a simple will can save a significant amount of money and time on death.
And Julia, just to close out this session, in your practice, what is your experience with people coming to you to do a retirement or financial plan that actually don't have a will, but after they've done this exercise with you, they've got that organized?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely happens all the time. Very often people will say, oh, yes, I don't have a will, or I have a will and I've been needing to update that, and it's very old. And I totally get that. That's one of the things I always say to people. I mean, why would you want to spend a bunch of time and money on something that you hope really never happens? So like the motivation to get those kind of estate and incapacity documents into place, it's really, really hard to muster it up. And it's one of the reasons why we consider ourselves accountability partners and are constantly poking people. It's time to get that will done. Here's the name of a lawyer you can talk to. Would you like me to be present at that meeting? Like, I'm just going to push people along and try to get them into it, because it's not an easy thing to think about. And it's frustrating. It's confusing. There's a lot of stuff that people, consider. They're like, well, who's the right person to be my executor, and what does that even mean, and how big of a job is that, and what if I want to give this much money or appoint this person as a guardian, and then what it'll change, right? My life will change, and so maybe that's the wrong decision. So I always say, like, there's nothing wrong with revisiting it even just every 5 years and be like, oh yeah, no, wait, that changed. So try to build that into the rhythm of the discussion so it feels less and less uncomfortable.
Awesome. Well, Lucy, over your shoulder, you've got keep calm and carry on. So I'll say keep calm and carry on, making sure your will is up to date. Thank you, Julie and Lucy. And we've covered a lot today, and I know literally we've only tapped the surface. It's frustrating to me. I hope other people watching this have found it helpful. But there is way more on this, and there's other topics of interest to our clients at Steadyhand and Canadians in general. And I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be kept up to date on new videos when they're posted. And if you have any topics you'd like us to cover, please let us know in the comments. But for now, thanks for tuning in, and bye for now.